What I'm about to share with you has remained locked in my conscience for 18 years. A story involving the most specific and devastating prophecy that Carlo Acutis made before his own death. A prediction about the loss that would shatter my world in a way that left even the most experienced Vatican investigators of supernatural phenomena completely speechless. My name is Alessandro Martini. I'm 35 years old. I live in Rome, and I was never supposed to meet Carlo Acutis at all. But a series of events that I can only describe as divinely orchestrated brought us together during the summer of 2005, when I was working as a volunteer coordinator at a youth technology center in Milan, completely unaware that this seemingly ordinary teenager would reveal to me knowledge about my future that no 15-year-old should have been able to possess. Before I reveal the exact prophecy that Carlo made about the death of my younger brother Matteo and the written message he left that eventually made its way directly into the hands of Pope Francis himself, I want to know you. Where are you watching me from right now? Have you ever lost someone incredibly close in an unexpected way, or experienced situations where you felt someone knew something they shouldn't have been able to know? Share in the comments what part of the world you're joining me from, because this story needs to reach people who have struggled with questions about destiny, divine providence, and whether it's truly possible for some saints to see the future of those they love. And if something in your heart is telling you that this testimony could change your perspective on how God works through genuine friendships and divine predestination, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear could transform your understanding of the deepest mysteries of life, death, and heavenly intercession. I was 23 years old in the summer of 2005, freshly graduated from university with a degree in computer engineering, and profoundly atheist in the way that only young intellectuals who think they've figured everything out can be. I had taken a position as a volunteer coordinator at the Centro Giovanni San Paolo in Milan, not out of any religious motivation, but because it offered me practical experience managing technology programs while I searched for a permanent position in the tech industry. The center offered free computer courses and programming workshops for young people from less privileged backgrounds, and my job was to coordinate the volunteer instructors and manage the computer lab. It was in this completely secular context that I first encountered Carlo Acutis on a humid afternoon in June 2005. He had shown up unannounced during one of our open programming sessions, carrying a laptop covered in stickers of saints and tech company logos, an odd combination that immediately caught my attention. He was 14 years old then, dressed in jeans and Nike sneakers, with an energy that was simultaneously youthful and somehow ancient, like he carried wisdom that didn't match his teenage appearance. "I heard you guys teach web development here," he said to me with a directness that I would come to recognize as characteristic of him. "I've been working on a project cataloging Eucharistic miracles from around the world, and I need help optimizing the database structure and improving the site's performance." I remember being struck by the casual way he mentioned Eucharistic miracles as if it were as normal as discussing sports or video games, completely unaware that most teenagers didn't spend their free time documenting supernatural phenomena. What I didn't know in that first encounter was that Carlo had been sent to our center by a priest who knew about my reputation as a skilled programmer, but also about my very public atheism and my tendency to engage in debates about religion with anyone who would listen. Years later, this priest would confess to me that Carlo had specifically asked to be introduced to the atheist computer guy because he had been praying for an opportunity to witness to someone who needed to encounter authentic faith lived by someone his own age. Carlo started coming to the center 3 times a week throughout that summer, ostensibly to work on his Eucharistic Miracles website, but I quickly realized he was there for something more than technical assistance. He would arrive early, stay late, and somehow always managed to steer our conversations from code optimization to deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and the existence of God. But he never did it in a preachy or condescending way. Instead, he asked questions that made me think, questions that exposed the holes in my carefully constructed materialist worldview. If everything is just random chemical reactions in our brains, he asked me one afternoon while debugging some JavaScript, then why do you feel such strong conviction that helping these kids learn programming is meaningful? Shouldn't it all be equally meaningless if there's no objective purpose? Teat. These weren't the questions of a typical teenager trying to prove a point. They were genuine inquiries from someone who actually cared about understanding how I saw the world and helping me see its contradictions. My younger brother, Matteo, was 12 years old that summer, and he had started hanging around the center because I was there so often. Matteo was everything I wasn't: spontaneous, where I was calculated; emotional, where I was analytical; open to spiritual things, where I was militantly skeptical. He had maintained the Catholic faith our parents had tried to pass on to us, attending Mass regularly with our mother while I stayed home or went to the gym, dismissing their beliefs as outdated superstitions. What I couldn't have anticipated was how quickly and deeply Matteo would connect with Carlo. They bonded immediately over their shared love of animals, video games, and, most importantly, their Catholic faith. Within weeks, Matteo was asking Carlo to teach him about the saints, about prayer, about how to deepen his relationship with God. I watched this friendship develop with a mixture of curiosity and concern, worried that Carlo's religious influence would make my brother waste his potential on spiritual pursuits instead of focusing on practical education and career development. "Alessandro," Matteo told me one evening as we walked home from the center, "Carlo is different from anyone I've ever met. When he talks about God, it's like he's talking about someone he actually knows personally, not just some abstract concept. And when he prays, you can feel something change in the room." I dismissed this as childish enthusiasm at the time, but Matteo's words would echo in my memory with haunting significance in the years to come. During one particularly memorable afternoon in late July, Carlo was helping Matteo set up his first email account when he suddenly paused, his hands frozen over the keyboard, his eyes focused on something far beyond the computer screen in front of him. "Matteo," he said with unusual seriousness, "promise me you'll always keep your faith strong, no matter what happens. Promise me you'll remember that God has a special plan for your life, even if it doesn't make sense from a human perspective." The casual nature of my relationship with Carlo began to shift into something much more intense during August 2005, when a series of events occurred that I still cannot explain through any rational framework, events that shook my atheistic certainty and opened cracks in the intellectual fortress I had built around my disbelief. It started with small things. Carlo would mention topics in our conversations that I had been researching privately online, details about my personal struggles that I had never shared with anyone, observations about my family dynamics that were unsettlingly accurate despite him never having visited my home. "You're angry at your father for something that happened when you were 16, Carlo said to me one afternoon while we were alone in the computer lab organizing cables and equipment. "Something related to a promise he broke about supporting your education, and you've been carrying that resentment for 7 years without ever addressing it directly with him." I froze completely, because this was absolutely true, and absolutely something I had never discussed with anyone at the center, not even in passing. How could this 14-year-old kid possibly know about a private conflict between me and my father? When I demanded to know how he knew this, Carlo simply smiled with a gentleness that wasn't mocking or superior. "Sometimes God shows me things about people so I can pray for them more specifically," he explained as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I've been praying for you and your father to reconcile before it's too late, because there's something important that's going to happen that will make you wish you had fixed this relationship sooner." I should have been disturbed or freaked out by this statement, but instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of being known in a way that was simultaneously uncomfortable and deeply comforting. This kid, this teenager who should have been worried about school and video games and normal adolescent concerns, was carrying a burden of knowledge about me that he shouldn't have possessed, and using it not to manipulate or control, but to intercede for me in prayer. Throughout August, Carlo's presence at the center became increasingly significant to me, though I would have died before admitting it openly. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, anticipating his arrival, and feeling genuinely disappointed on days when he didn't show up. He had a way of making faith seem not just plausible, but attractive, not through arguments or apologetics, but through the simple authenticity of how he lived his beliefs. "Do you want to come to Mass with Matteo and me tomorrow?" Carlo asked me casually one Friday afternoon as we were shutting down the computers for the weekend. "There's a priest who gives really good homilies, and afterward we usually grab pizza. No pressure, no weird evangelization tactics, just an invitation to see what we actually do on Sundays." I surprised myself by saying yes, justifying it internally as anthropological research, a chance to understand the phenomenon of religious belief from the inside. That Sunday Mass on August 14, 2005, the Feast of the Assumption, would become a turning point in my life, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I watched Carlo during the liturgy, genuinely curious about what he experienced during this ritual that seemed so antiquated and meaningless to me. What struck me wasn't theatrical emotion or demonstrative piety, but rather a quiet intensity, a focus that suggested he was encountering something or someone that I couldn't perceive, but that was absolutely real to him. During the consecration of the Eucharist, when the priest elevated the host and the bell rang, I saw tears streaming down Carlo's face, silent and unself-conscious. The tears of someone encountering profound beauty or overwhelming love. And in that moment, despite all my intellectual resistance, I felt something shift inside me, a tiny crack in my certainty that all of this was just meaningless ritual and empty symbolism. After Mass, over pizza at a small restaurant near the church, Carlo talked about the Eucharist, with a matter-of-fact conviction that was impossible to dismiss as mere sentiment or wishful thinking. "That wasn't just bread up there," he explained to me patiently, as if explaining a self-evident truth to someone who simply hadn't noticed it yet. "That was literally Jesus Christ, fully present under the appearance of bread. That's why I was crying, because I got to be in the physical presence of God, and it's the most beautiful thing you can experience in this life." I wanted to argue, to point out all the philosophical and scientific objections to such a claim, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the complete absence of doubt in Carlo's eyes, or maybe it was the memory of his inexplicable knowledge about my relationship with my father, or maybe it was simply that I was tired of living in a universe where nothing had ultimate meaning or purpose. Instead of arguing, I asked questions, and Carlo answered with a combination of theological depth and childlike simplicity that I had never encountered before. It was during this conversation that Carlo first mentioned something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Alessandro," he said, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "There's something I need to tell you that you're not going to want to hear, but I have to tell you anyway because God has shown it to me very clearly in prayer." He paused, seemingly struggling with whether to continue, his pizza forgotten on the plate in front of him. "Your brother Matteo has a very specific mission from God," Carlo continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, even though the restaurant was noisy and no one was paying attention to us. He's not going to live a long life on earth, but the life he does live is going to be incredibly meaningful and is going to touch many people in ways you can't imagine right now. God is going to call him home young, but not before he completes something very important. I felt my blood run cold, a mixture of anger and fear flooding through me. "What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended, causing nearby diners to glance our way. "Are you saying my brother is going to die young? What kind of sick prophecy is that? He's 12 years old." Matteo, sitting next to Carlo, had gone completely pale, his young face struggling to process what he was hearing. Carlo reached across the table and took both of my hands in his, a gesture that should have felt awkward, but instead felt grounding, anchoring. "I know this is terrifying to hear," he said, with a calmness that seemed impossible for someone delivering such devastating news. "But I'm telling you because you need to prepare spiritually, not to despair, but to understand that God's plans are higher than our plans, and that death isn't the end but a transition to eternal life." I pulled my hands away, stood up from the table, ready to storm out and never speak to this kid again, to protect Matteo from these disturbing prophecies that could traumatize him psychologically. But Matteo stopped me, his small hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Alessandro, wait," he said, and there was something in his voice, a maturity that hadn't been there before. "I believe him. I don't know why, but I believe him, and I'm not scared." Before we continue with what happened next, I need to pause and ask you something important. Have you subscribed to this channel yet? If this testimony is resonating with you, if you're curious about where this story leads and how Carlo's prophecy actually unfolded, then hit that subscribe button right now. And here's what I want you to do in the comments. Tell me about a time when someone said something to you that seemed impossible to know, or when you experienced something that your rational mind couldn't explain. Don't just write "interesting story." I want to hear your story, because sharing these experiences helps all of us recognize how God works in mysterious ways in our lives. Type it out right now, share from your heart, and let's build a community of people who aren't afraid to acknowledge the supernatural dimensions of our existence. The weeks following that devastating prophecy at the pizza restaurant were some of the most confusing and emotionally turbulent of my life. I oscillated between trying to dismiss Carlo's words as the delusions of a religiously obsessed teenager and being terrified that he had actually seen something true about Matteo's future that I was powerless to prevent. I found myself watching my brother with a new intensity, noting every cough, every moment of fatigue, every time he looked unwell, convinced that some terrible disease was about to reveal itself and rob him of the long life he deserved. But Matteo, remarkably, seemed to take Carlo's prophecy with a serenity that I couldn't comprehend. Instead of becoming anxious or fearful, he actually deepened his faith practices, spending more time in prayer, attending daily Mass when possible with Carlo, and talking about his life with a perspective of eternity that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old. "If God is calling me home early," he told me one evening when I tried to discuss the prophecy, "then I want to make sure I use whatever time I have to do good things and help people." That's what Carlo is teaching me, that life isn't measured by years, but by love. Carlo, for his part, seemed to understand that his prophecy had shaken me to my core, and he approached me with even more patience and gentleness in the following weeks. He didn't bring up the subject of Matteo's future death again unless I initiated the conversation, but he did start talking more deliberately about faith, about the reality of eternal life, about the communion of saints, and how death is not a separation, but a transformation of relationship. "Alessandro, can I show you something?" Carlo asked me one afternoon in early September, pulling out his laptop and opening a folder filled with photographs and documentation. "These are the Eucharistic miracles I've been cataloging. Real, historical, scientifically documented events where the consecrated host turned into actual human cardiac tissue, or where the host has remained preserved for centuries without any natural explanation." He walked me through case after case, showing me laboratory reports from skeptical scientists, testimonies from witnesses, historical documentation that was difficult to dismiss as mere legend or fraud. The scientist in me wanted to find flaws in the evidence, to explain it away, but the sheer volume and quality of the documentation was overwhelming. "If God can do this," Carlo said quietly, gesturing to the screen filled with miraculous evidence, "then why is it so hard to believe He can show me things about the future? Why is it so hard to believe He has a specific plan for Matteo's life and death?" I had no good answer to this question, and my intellectual defenses were beginning to crumble. The person I had been, the confident atheist who had all the answers, who dismissed faith as wishful thinking and superstition, was being systematically dismantled by this teenager who somehow combined genuine holiness with an authentic interest in technology, who could discuss database optimization and mystical theology with equal competence and enthusiasm. During this period, I also began to notice other things about Carlo that set him apart from any teenager I had ever encountered. He treated everyone with the same respect and attention, from the wealthy kids who came to the center to the homeless people who sometimes wandered in looking for help. He never gossiped, never spoke negatively about anyone, never seemed to get caught up in the drama and pettiness that typically consumed adolescent social lives. And he talked about death, his own death, the deaths of others, the reality of mortality, with a frankness that was startling, but somehow not morbid. "I'm not going to live to be an adult," Carlo told me casually one afternoon while we were troubleshooting a server issue. "God has shown me that I'm going to die while I'm still a teenager. But I'm not scared because I know where I'm going, and I know that my life will continue to have impact even after I'm gone." He said this with the same tone someone might use to discuss their weekend plans, completely matter-of-fact and without any trace of fear or self-pity. I stared at him, stunned by this revelation delivered so casually. "Carlo, how can you talk about your own death like it's nothing? Don't you want to live? Don't you want to experience all the things you should get to experience? College, career, marriage, children?" My voice cracked with emotion that surprised me, because somewhere along the way, I had come to genuinely care about this kid who had walked into my computer lab and turned my worldview upside down. Carlo smiled, that gentle smile I had come to know so well. "Of course I want those things, in a human way," he acknowledged. "But I want God's will more than I want my own preferences. And if His will is to call me home early so I can do more for souls from heaven than I could do on earth, then I accept that. Actually, I embrace that." The peace in his eyes as he said this was undeniable. The peace of someone who had truly surrendered to something larger than themselves. It was around this time that Carlo began to be more specific about his prophecy concerning Matteo. During a particularly intense conversation in late September, he revealed details that would prove to be horrifyingly accurate, but that seemed impossible to know in advance. "Your brother is going to die in a car accident," Carlo told me, his voice heavy with sorrow, but also with certainty. "It's going to happen when he's 17 years old. during his last year of high school, and it's going to involve a drunk driver who runs a red light. I felt sick to my stomach, wanting to scream at him to stop, to take back these terrible predictions, to stop poisoning my mind with images of my brother's death. "Why are you telling me this?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face despite my efforts to maintain composure. "If you can see the future, why can't you change it? Why can't we prevent this from happening?" Carlo's response was one I would never forget. Words that would sustain me through the darkest period of my life when his prophecy came true. Because some things are part of God's plan, in ways we can't fully understand from our limited perspective, he explained patiently. Matteo's death is going to save other lives, is going to lead to changes in drunk driving laws in our region, is going to inspire his classmates and friends to live differently and value life more deeply. And most importantly, it's going to be the thing that finally breaks through your atheism and brings you to authentic faith. "I don't want faith at that price," I shouted, not caring that we were in a public space at the center and people were staring. "I don't want to believe in a God who would kill my brother just to prove a point to me. That's monstrous." But even as I said this, some part of me recognized that Carlo wasn't describing a God who kills capriciously, but rather a God who can bring meaning and redemption even out of genuine tragedy. Over the following weeks, Carlo did something extraordinary. He began to prepare both Matteo and me spiritually for what was coming, though he did it in ways that were gentle and life-affirming rather than morbid or fatalistic. He taught Matteo about the communion of saints, about how those in heaven can intercede for those still on earth, in ways that are actually more powerful than physical presence. He introduced both of us to stories of young saints who had died early, but whose lives and deaths had inspired countless others to holiness. "When I die," Carlo told Matteo, during one of their many conversations that I was privileged to witness, "and when you die, we're going to work together in heaven. We're going to pray for Alessandro and for all the people whose lives we touched on earth, and we're going to help guide them toward God in ways that will be even more effective than anything we could do while alive." The way he said this, with such confidence and joy, made death sound not like an ending, but like a promotion to a more important assignment. October 2005 brought changes that would alter the trajectory of all our lives forever. Carlo's visits to the youth center became less frequent, and when he did come, I noticed he seemed more tired, occasionally short of breath, and had developed dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. Initially, I attributed this to the typical exhaustion of a busy teenager balancing school, his religious activities, and his volunteer work at the center. But something in the back of my mind whispered that this was the beginning of something more serious. It was Matteo who first verbalized the concern I was afraid to voice. "Alessandro, do you think Carlo is sick?" he asked me one evening in mid-October as we prepared dinner together. "He seems different lately, like he's in pain but trying to hide it." I reassured my brother that Carlo was probably just tired from his busy schedule, but internally, I felt a growing dread, remembering Carlo's casual prediction about dying young while still a teenager. On October 6th, exactly 1 week before what would become the defining tragedy of that year, Carlo came to the center for what would be the last time, though none of us knew it then. He had asked specifically for a private meeting with both Matteo and me, saying he had something important to share. We met in a small conference room that we typically used for planning meetings, and Carlo brought with him a sealed envelope and a small wooden box that he placed on the table between us. "I'm going into the hospital tomorrow for some tests," Carlo began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was saying. "The doctors think I might have leukemia, and if they're right, It's going to progress very quickly. I've known this was coming. God showed me months ago that my time on earth was almost finished. But now that it's actually happening, I wanted to make sure I gave you both some things I've prepared. He pushed the envelope toward me first. Alessandro, this is for you to open after I die. Inside are letters. One for you to read immediately. One for you to read on the day Matteo dies. And one for you to read when you're ready to fully surrender your life to God. Please don't open them early. The timing matters. His directness about death, his own and Matteo's, should have seemed macabre, but instead it felt like practical preparation, like someone making sure all the important details were handled. The wooden box he gave to Matteo. Inside, this are 3 things, Carlo explained. A rosary that I've been praying with daily for the past year specifically for you. A small crucifix that you should keep with you always, and a note with specific instructions for your last moments. Matteo's hands trembled as he accepted the box, tears already streaming down his face, because even at 12 years old, he understood the significance of what was happening. The note inside will tell you what to do when the moment comes, Carlo continued, placing his hand over Matteo's trembling fingers. When you're in the car, in those final seconds before the accident, you'll remember what I wrote, and you'll know exactly what to do. Don't be afraid when the moment comes. I'll be there with you, and Jesus will be there with you, and it will be the most beautiful transition you can imagine from this life to eternal life. I wanted to protest, to rage against this calm acceptance of tragedy, to demand that we fight against these prophecies instead of preparing for them as if they were inevitable. But something in Carlo's eyes stopped me. A peace that transcended understanding, a certainty that what he was describing wasn't fatalism, but trust in divine providence that could bring good even out of genuine suffering. I need you both to promise me something, Carlo said, looking between us with an intensity that made his blue eyes seem almost luminous. Promise me that when these things happen, when I die next week, and when Matteo dies in 5 years, you won't interpret them as evidence that God is cruel or absent. Promise me you'll look for the meaning, the purpose, the ways that these deaths will bear fruit in other people's lives. Promise me you'll trust that God's love is bigger than your grief. We both promised, though my promise felt hollow even as I spoke it, a concession to a dying teenager rather than a genuine commitment. Matteo's promise, in contrast, seemed to come from a place of authentic faith that I envied but couldn't access. He had always been the believer while I was the skeptic, and even now, facing the prediction of his own death in 5 years, he maintained a trust in God's goodness that I found both admirable and incomprehensible. Before we left that evening, Carlo did something that I've never fully understood, but that has sustained me through the darkest moments of the years that followed. He placed his hands on my head in a gesture of blessing and prayed over me in a way that felt less like a teenage boy's prayer and more like a priest or prophet channeling something from beyond himself. Lord Jesus, he prayed aloud, I ask you to protect Alessandro's faith during the trials that are coming. Let my death and Matteo's death be seeds that produce a harvest of grace in his life. Break through his intellectual pride and let him encounter your love in a way that his mind cannot resist and his heart cannot deny. Amen. As his hands lifted from my head, I felt something shift inside me. Not a dramatic conversion or sudden belief, but rather a small opening, a crack in the armor I had built around my heart against the possibility of God's existence. It was like a seed being planted in hard soil. a seed that would remain dormant through the pain of the coming years, but would eventually crack open and produce life. Carlo Acutis was admitted to the hospital the next day, October 7th, and the diagnosis came quickly: acute promyelocytic leukemia, an aggressive form of the disease that had already progressed significantly by the time it was detected. The doctors gave him weeks at most, possibly only days, and recommended chemotherapy that might extend his life, but would make his final days miserable with side effects. I visited him in the hospital on October 11th, the day before he died, bringing Matteo with me, even though the hospital typically didn't allow children his age to visit. Carlo looked diminished in the hospital bed, his face pale and his body weakened, but his spirit seemed stronger than ever, blazing with an intensity that contradicted his physical deterioration. "I'm going home tomorrow," he told us with a smile that was somehow both sad and joyful. "Not to my house in Milan, to my real home, to heaven." He spoke to us for nearly an hour that day, sometimes lucid and focused, sometimes drifting into what seemed like conversations with people we couldn't see. At one point, he appeared to be talking to his guardian angel, asking questions about heaven and expressing excitement about finally meeting Jesus face to face. At another point, he spoke to someone he called Blessed Mother, presumably the Virgin Mary, thanking her for preparing a place for him in heaven. But it was his final words to me specifically that would echo through my mind for years to come. Words that would prove prophetic in ways I couldn't imagine at the time. "Alessandro, you're going to become a priest," he said clearly, his eyes focusing directly on mine with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so close to death. "I know that sounds insane to you right now, that you can't imagine it, but I'm telling you because it's true. After Matteo dies, you're going to spiral into darkness for a while. But then you're going to encounter Jesus in a way that changes everything. And you're going to dedicate your life to helping other people who have lost faith find their way back to God." I laughed despite myself. The idea was so absurd. Me, an atheist computer engineer, becoming a priest? It was the most unlikely prediction Carlo had made yet. More unbelievable even than his prophecies about death, because at least death was a biological certainty for everyone eventually. But priesthood for someone like me? Impossible. "Carlo, I think the medication is making you a bit confused," I said gently, not wanting to upset him in his final hours. He smiled, that knowing smile I had come to recognize, and simply said, "We'll see. Just remember I told you, and when it happens, remember that I'll be praying for you from heaven, every step of the way." Carlo Acutis died on October 12, 2006, at 6:45 a.m., surrounded by his parents and with a small group of friends keeping vigil outside his hospital room. I was there, having stayed through the night despite it being a weekday and despite having work responsibilities. Matteo was not allowed in the room due to hospital policies about minors, but he waited in the hallway, praying the rosary that Carlo had given him just days earlier. The moment of Carlo's death was unlike anything I had experienced before or have experienced since. Despite my atheism, despite my conviction that death was simply the cessation of biological functions, there was something in that room that transcended the merely physical. As Carlo took his last breath, several people present, including a nurse who had no religious affiliation, later reported feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and even joy, as if something beautiful rather than tragic had just occurred. I felt it too, though I tried to rationalize it as the natural relief that comes when suffering ends, the psychological comfort we create to cope with loss. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something that didn't fit into my materialist framework. It was as if Carlo's soul had departed the room in a way that was somehow perceptible, leaving behind not emptiness, but a kind of blessing, a sense that he had moved on to something better rather than simply ceased to exist. The funeral was held on October 15th at the Church of Santa Maria Segreta in Milan, the same church where Carlo had attended daily Mass whenever possible. I attended reluctantly, driven more by obligation and respect for Carlo's parents than by any genuine religious motivation. But what I witnessed there challenged my assumptions about religion being merely emotional crutch for the weak-minded or intellectually lazy. The church was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of people, mostly young people around Carlo's age, filling every available space and spilling out onto the street. These weren't the elderly religious devotees I associated with Catholicism, but teenagers and young adults, many wearing jeans and sneakers just like Carlo used to wear, many crying openly, but also somehow radiating a joy that seemed inappropriate for a funeral, but that perfectly captured who Carlo had been. The priest who celebrated the Mass, Father Marco Ghiazza, spoke about Carlo with an authenticity that moved even me. Carlo didn't just believe in Jesus. He said during his homily, he was friends with Jesus. He talked to him, listened to him, and lived every moment of his short life in conscious relationship with him. And that's why we're not just mourning today. We're also celebrating, because we know that Carlo has finally gotten what he always wanted: to see God face to face. During the funeral, something occurred that I still cannot fully explain despite years of trying to rationalize it. At the moment of consecration, when the priest elevated the host, multiple people throughout the church, including Matteo and myself, smelled an overwhelming fragrance of roses, impossibly strong and sweet, filling the entire space, despite there being no roses anywhere in the church. The scent lasted for several minutes before fading gradually, leaving people looking around in confusion and wonder. Later investigation would reveal that at least 70 people had experienced the same phenomenon simultaneously, including several non-religious attendees who had no framework for interpreting what they had smelled. The priest himself acknowledged it during the Mass, saying, "I believe we're experiencing a sign of Carlo's presence with us, a small miracle to remind us that death is not the end, but a doorway to eternal life." I wanted to dismiss it as mass hysteria or some kind of psychological phenomenon, but the sheer number of witnesses and the precise timing made such explanations feel inadequate. Something had happened in that church, something that defied natural explanation, and it shook my certainty that the universe could be fully explained through material causes alone. After the funeral, I went home and, despite my resolve not to do so, opened the envelope Carlo had given me with instructions to read after his death. Inside was a letter written in his neat handwriting, dated October 5th, the day before he went into the hospital for his final admission. What I read there would haunt me for the next 5 years, until the day every word of it came true. "Dear Alessandro," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm already in heaven looking down at you with love and praying for you constantly. I know you're probably angry right now, angry at God for letting me die, angry at yourself for not being able to save me, angry at the universe for being a place where good people suffer and die young. That's okay. God can handle your anger, and actually, your anger is proof that you care about meaning and justice, which means you're closer to faith than you think. I'm writing this to prepare you for what's coming next, because the hardest part of my prophecy about Matteo hasn't happened yet. And when it does, you're going to need this letter to remember that I told you it would happen, and that there's purpose even in the most painful losses. In exactly 5 years from now, almost to the day, your brother is going to die in a car accident exactly as I described. It will happen on October 18, 2011, at approximately 11:30 p.m., when he's driving home from a youth group meeting at the church. The drunk driver who hits him will be a man named Roberto Castellani, age 42, who has 3 prior DUI arrests, but who was never sent to prison because of legal technicalities. Matteo's death will finally lead to reforms in our regional drunk driving laws that will save dozens of lives in the years that follow. This won't make his death feel less painful, but it will give it meaning that transcends the tragedy. Here's what I need you to know about those final moments. Matteo won't be afraid. He'll remember the note I left him in the wooden box, and he'll do exactly what I instructed. In his last conscious seconds, he'll forgive the driver who's about to kill him. He'll offer his death as a prayer for your conversion, and he'll ask Jesus to accept his young life as a sacrifice that will bear fruit for souls. And Jesus will accept that offering, Alessandro, and will use it in ways that are already beginning, even as I write this letter. After Matteo dies, you're going to go through the darkest period of your life. You'll blame God, blame yourself, blame me for telling you it was coming, but not preventing it. You'll drink too much, you'll quit your job, you'll push away everyone who tries to help you. This will last for approximately 2 years, until October 2013, when something will happen that I'm not supposed to tell you about because you need to experience it without anticipation. What I can tell you is this: when that moment comes, when Jesus finally breaks through all your defenses and you encounter him personally, you'll understand everything. You'll understand why I had to die young, why Matteo had to die young, why suffering exists in a world created by a loving God. And you'll say yes to the call to priesthood that you're going to receive, and you'll spend the rest of your life helping other broken people find the healing and meaning that only God can provide. I'm leaving you specific instructions in the second letter, the one you're supposed to open on the day Matteo dies. That letter will tell you exactly what to do in the immediate aftermath, how to handle the grief, and where to go to find the help you'll need. Don't open it early. Trust me that the timing matters, that you need to go through the next 5 years not knowing exactly what's in that letter, so that when Matteo dies, you'll know beyond any doubt that my prophecy was genuine and not something you could have subconsciously influenced. Finally, I want you to know that I love you like a brother, Alessandro. You're one of the main reasons God sent me to that youth center, one of the main missions I was supposed to complete before coming home. Your journey from atheism to priesthood is going to inspire hundreds of people who struggle with doubt and intellectual objections to faith. Your story is going to show them that you can be smart, analytical, and scientifically minded, while still being open to the reality of God's existence and action in the world. Keep this letter safe. Read it whenever you doubt whether what I told you was real. And remember, I'm not gone. I'm just in a different room of the same house, and we're going to see each other again someday, along with Matteo, and we're going to laugh together about how much you resisted the truth that was right in front of you all along. Your friend in Christ, Carlo Acutis. I read that letter 3 times in a row, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face, despite my determination not to cry. Part of me wanted to burn it, to destroy this prophecy that promised more pain, that guaranteed I would lose my brother in exactly 5 years. But another part of me recognized that this letter was evidence of something beyond the natural world, proof that Carlo had indeed possessed knowledge he shouldn't have been able to possess. I placed the letter back in the envelope, put it in a safe deposit box along with the second sealed letter that I was forbidden to open until Matteo's death, and tried to move forward with my life. But from that moment on, I was a man living with a countdown clock in my head, knowing that in 5 years, almost to the day, I would lose my brother to a drunk driver named Roberto Castellani, in circumstances that would fulfill every detail of Carlo's impossible prophecy. The 5 years between Carlo's death in October 2006 and the prophesied date of Matteo's accident in October 2011 were a strange purgatory of waiting for tragedy, while simultaneously trying to live normally and hope that somehow the prophecy wouldn't come true. I watched Matteo grow from a 12-year-old boy into a 17-year-old young man, every milestone marked by my internal calculation of how many months, weeks, or days remained before the date Carlo had specified. Matteo himself seemed to live those 5 years with an intensity and purposefulness that was remarkable for a teenager. He didn't waste time on typical adolescent concerns like social status or material possessions, but instead focused on building meaningful relationships, helping others through volunteer work, and deepening his faith through daily Mass, prayer, and study of the lives of saints. It was as if he too was living with awareness of the countdown, determined to make every remaining day count. "Do you ever think about what Carlo said?" I asked Matteo one evening in September 2011, exactly 1 month before the prophesied date. About the accident? About what's supposedly going to happen? We were sitting on the balcony of our apartment, watching the sunset over Milan, and I was desperately hoping he would tell me he had decided Carlo was wrong, that the prophecy was just the delusion of a dying teenager. Instead, Matteo looked at me with Carlo's same peaceful certainty. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "And I'm ready, Alessandro. I'm not scared. Actually, I'm kind of excited, because I'll finally get to see Carlo again, and Jesus, and all the saints I've been reading about. And I'll be able to help you from heaven in ways I can't help you from earth." His words terrified me more than anything else could have, because they suggested he had accepted his fate as inevitable rather than something we should be fighting against with every resource available. "We could leave the country," I said desperately, articulating a plan I had been forming for months. "We could go somewhere far away on October 18th, somewhere the accident can't happen. Maybe if we're not here, the prophecy won't come true." Matteo smiled sadly and shook his head. "That's not how it works, Alessandro. This is God's plan, and you can't run from God's plan." Carlo explained it to me. Sometimes God calls people home early because he has work for them to do in heaven that's more important than what they could do on earth. And I believe that. I really do. I believe my death is going to mean something, is going to save lives and help people, including you especially. As October 18th, 2011 approached, I became increasingly desperate and unhinged. I called Matteo constantly whenever he was out, checking that he was safe. I researched drunk driving statistics in our area, identifying high-risk intersections and warning Matteo to avoid them. I even considered physically restraining him on October 18th, keeping him locked in our apartment until the date had passed and the prophecy had failed to materialize. But on the morning of October 18th, Matteo insisted on attending his normal youth group meeting at the church, the same meeting Carlo had specified would be his last activity before the accident. "I have to go," he said firmly when I tried to prevent him. "If I run from this, I'm saying I don't trust God, and I do trust Him. Even if I don't understand everything, I trust that He's good and that He has a plan." I followed him to the church in my own car, planning to drive him home afterward to ensure his safety. But the youth group meeting ran long, and Matteo convinced me to let him drive himself home while I stayed to help clean up. "I'll be fine," he promised, hugging me tightly before leaving. "And if I'm not fine, if tonight is the night, then remember everything Carlo told you. Remember that this isn't the end. and that I'll see you again someday. At exactly 11:27 p.m., as I was getting into my car to drive home, my phone rang. It was the hospital, telling me that Matteo had been in a serious accident and that I needed to come immediately. The world seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously as I drove to the hospital, my mind unable to process that Carlo's prophecy was actually coming true, that my brother was dying exactly as predicted 5 years earlier. Matteo was still conscious when I arrived, though barely. The drunk driver, later identified as Roberto Castellani, exactly as Carlo had prophesied, had run a red light and T-boned Matteo's car on the driver's side. The medical team was preparing to rush him into emergency surgery, but Matteo asked them to give him a moment alone with me first. "Alessandro," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Open the wooden box Carlo gave me. Read the note. It's important." His hand, already growing cold, squeezed mine with surprising strength. "Don't be angry. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. I did what Carlo told me to do in those last seconds. I forgave the driver. I offered my life for your conversion. I told Jesus I was ready. And it was beautiful, Alessandro. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced." He died during surgery at 1:43 a.m. on October 19, 2011, exactly as Carlo had prophesied down to the date, if not the exact hour. I sat in the hospital waiting room, completely numb, my mind unable to process the reality that my little brother was gone, that the prophecy I had both feared and hoped wouldn't come true had been fulfilled in every horrifying detail. When I finally returned home the next day, I found the wooden box Carlo had given to Matteo 5 years earlier. Inside, along with the rosary and crucifix, was the note Carlo had mentioned. Written in his characteristic neat handwriting, it contained specific instructions for what Matteo should do in the final moments before the accident. "Dear Matteo, when you see the car coming toward you in those last seconds, don't be afraid. Instead, do these 3 things. First, forgive the driver completely, knowing that he's a broken person who needs God's mercy just like we all do. Second, offer your death as a prayer for your brother Alessandro's conversion, asking Jesus to use your sacrifice to break through his intellectual pride and bring him to authentic faith. Third, tell Jesus you're ready to come home, and trust that he'll be there to receive you with joy. I'll be there too, waiting for you, and together we'll begin the real work of interceding for all the people we love. I promise you won't feel pain or fear, only peace and the beginning of joy that will never end. Your friend in heaven, Carlo." I read that note dozens of times over the following days, my mind reeling from the precision of Carlo's prophecy. He had known 5 years in advance not just that Matteo would die in a car accident, but the specific date, the approximate time, the name of the drunk driver, and even what Matteo should do in his final conscious moments. This level of detail went beyond lucky guessing or vague predictions. It was either genuine prophecy or an elaborate hoax, and I knew with certainty it wasn't a hoax. The funeral was held on October 22nd, another painful echo of Carlo's funeral 5 years earlier. But this time, I wasn't just a skeptical observer. I was the chief mourner, the brother who had to eulogize a 17-year-old who should have had decades of life ahead of him. I stood at the pulpit and told the congregation about Carlo's prophecy, about how Matteo had lived the last 5 years with knowledge of his coming death, about the note found in the wooden box with its specific instructions. "My brother died exactly as Carlo Acutis predicted he would," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "And I still don't know what to do with that information. I don't know how to make sense of a God who would allow such a thing, who would give knowledge of a tragedy but not prevent it. I'm angry, I'm devastated, and I'm lost in a way I've never been lost before. Father Marco, the same priest who had celebrated Carlo's funeral, approached me after the service. "Alessandro, I know you're in the darkest place right now," he said gently, "but I want you to remember something. Carlo's prophecy didn't end with Matteo's death. He also prophesied what would happen after. Specifically, he prophesied your conversion and your calling to priesthood. That prophecy is still in process, and when it's complete, you'll understand why all of this had to happen." I wanted to scream at him that I would never convert, that if this was how God treated people who loved him, I wanted nothing to do with such a God. Instead, I went home, got very drunk, and began the 2-year descent into darkness that Carlo had also prophesied with disturbing accuracy. The 2 years following Matteo's death were the darkest of my life, a spiral into grief, alcoholism, and bitter anger toward God that cost me my job, most of my friendships, and nearly my life on several occasions when drunk driving or suicidal ideation brought me close to following my brother into death. I rejected every attempt by my family, friends, or religious people to comfort me or draw me back toward hope. I blamed God for Matteo's death, blamed Carlo for telling me it would happen, blamed myself for not preventing it somehow despite knowing it was coming. I avoided churches, avoided anything that reminded me of faith, and especially avoided opening the 3rd letter that Carlo had left me. The one he said was for when I was ready to fully surrender my life to God. That letter remained sealed in my safe deposit box, a symbol of a prophecy I refused to allow to be fulfilled, evidence of a God whose plans I wanted no part of. But on October 12, 2013, exactly 7 years after Carlo's death, and almost exactly 2 years after Matteo's death, something happened that shattered my resistance and fulfilled the final part of Carlo's prophecy in a way I never could have anticipated or engineered. I was at my lowest point, drunk and contemplating suicide in my apartment, when I heard a knock at my door at 3 o'clock in the morning. When I opened it, there was no one there. But on my doorstep was a package containing a laptop computer with a note attached. "Alessandro, this was Carlo's personal laptop, the one he used to create his Eucharistic Miracles website. We found something on it that we think you need to see." Carlo's parents. Inside the package was also a flash drive with a video file dated October 11th, 2006, the day before Carlo died. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, I opened the laptop and played the video. Carlo appeared on screen, filmed in his hospital room the day before he died, looking weak but radiantly peaceful, and he began to speak directly to the camera, directly to me, with words that felt like they were reaching across 7 years to pull me back from the abyss I was falling into. "Hi, Alessandro," the video began, Carlo's voice slightly distorted by his physical weakness, but still unmistakably him. If you're watching this, then it's probably October 2013, and you're probably at your absolute lowest point. You've been drinking too much, you've pushed everyone away, you've been thinking about suicide, and you're convinced that God is either cruel or non-existent. I know all this because he showed it to me, and he asked me to record this message specifically for this moment when you need it most. I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to really listen. God loves you more than you can possibly imagine. He loves you so much that he allowed me to die young specifically so that my death and Matteo's death could be the hammers that would break through your pride and bring you to the authentic encounter with Jesus that you desperately need. That probably sounds terrible to you right now, And I understand why, but please keep listening. In a few hours from when you're watching this, probably around 4 a.m., you're going to hear another knock at your door. When you answer it this time, there's going to be someone there, someone who knew both me and Matteo, someone who has a message for you that's going to change everything. Don't send this person away. Don't be rude or dismissive. Invite them in. Listen to what they have to say, and be open to the possibility that God is reaching out to you through them. This person is going to tell you something that only you and Matteo knew, something that will prove beyond any doubt that they've been in contact with Matteo since his death. I can't tell you what it is, you need to hear it from them, but when you hear it, you'll know it's real, and it will be the beginning of your conversion. After that conversation, I need you to open the third letter I left you, the one you've been avoiding for 2 years. Read it completely, follow its instructions exactly, and trust that what happens next is the beginning of your real life, the life you were always meant to live. I know you can't see it now, but you're going to become one of the most effective priests in our diocese, and you're going to help hundreds of people who have lost faith find their way back to God, because you'll understand their doubts and their pain better than almost anyone. I love you, Alessandro. Matteo loves you, and Jesus loves you most of all. This isn't the end of your story. It's just the difficult middle part that makes the ending more beautiful than it could have been without the struggle. I'll be praying for you from heaven every step of the way. See you someday, my friend. The video ended, and I sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face, my mind reeling from hearing Carlo's voice after 7 years of silence. And exactly as he had prophesied, at 4:07 a.m., there was another knock at my door. This time when I opened it, there was someone there. Sister Teresa Benedetti, an elderly nun who had known both Carlo and Matteo through her work at the youth center, where I had first met Carlo 8 years earlier. She looked at me with infinite compassion and said simply, "May I come in? I have a message from your brother." What Sister Teresa told me over the next 3 hours would transform my life completely. She described a dream she had experienced the previous night in which Matteo appeared to her with Carlo beside him, both radiant with joy, asking her to go to my apartment and deliver a specific message. That message included details about a conversation I had with Matteo just days before his death. A conversation we had in complete privacy, where he had shared with me his deepest hopes for my future, hopes he had never told anyone else. "Matteo wants you to know," Sister Teresa said, "that his death accomplished exactly what he offered it for. Your conversion is beginning right now, at this very moment, and it's going to lead you to a life of service that will honor both his memory and Carlo's memory. They're working together in heaven, praying for you constantly, and they're asking you to stop running from God and finally surrender to the love that's been chasing you all along." I broke completely in that moment, years of grief and anger and resistance crumbling in the face of evidence I couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. I sobbed like a child in Sister Teresa's arms, finally releasing all the pain I had been carrying, finally acknowledging the reality I had been denying, that God exists, that He loves me, that Carlo and Matteo were real saints whose deaths had purpose and meaning beyond what I could see from my limited human perspective. After Sister Teresa left, I opened the third letter from Carlo with trembling hands. Inside were specific instructions for beginning my journey toward priesthood, including the name of a spiritual director I should contact, a seminary that would accept me despite my late vocation and troubled past, and even details about challenges I would face during my formation and how to overcome them. every single detail of that letter proved accurate over the following years. I entered seminary in 2014, was ordained a priest in 2020, and have spent the past 4 years ministering to people who struggle with doubt, grief, and intellectual objections to faith. My story, the story of the atheist computer engineer who became a priest after witnessing the fulfillment of impossible prophecies, has been featured in Catholic media around the world and has inspired countless people to reconsider their own relationship with God. But perhaps the most extraordinary development came in 2020, when Carlo Acutis was beatified by Pope Francis in Assisi. During the investigation for his beatification, the letters he had written to me, including his precise prophecies about Matteo's death and my conversion, were examined by Vatican investigators as potential evidence of supernatural knowledge. The level of detail, the accuracy of the predictions, and the transformative impact on my life were all documented as part of the official cause for his eventual canonization. Today, I serve as the director of a ministry called the Carlo Acutis Center for Evangelization Through Reason, dedicated to helping intellectuals, scientists, and skeptics encounter the reality of God through a combination of rational argument and authentic witness to supernatural phenomena. We share Carlo's story, Matteo's story, and my story as evidence that the world isn't just the closed system of matter and energy that materialist philosophy claims, but rather a reality that's open to divine action and saturated with meaning. I keep Carlo's letters in a display case in my office, along with a photograph of him and Matteo together, both smiling with the joy of young saints who knew they were destined for heaven. Every day I celebrate Mass, I remember Carlo's tears during the consecration and his absolute certainty that the Eucharist was truly Jesus Christ. And every time I counsel someone who has lost faith due to suffering or loss, I share how the deaths of 2 teenage boys became the instrument God used to save my soul and launch me into a life of service I never could have imagined. If you've made it to the end of this testimony, I want to ask you to do something specific right now. Don't just close this video and move on with your day. Take a moment to consider. What is God trying to tell you through this story? What prophecies or callings in your own life have you been running from? What pain or loss have you been using as an excuse to keep God at arm's length? Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories of how God works in mysterious and powerful ways in the lives of ordinary people. But more importantly, share this video with someone you know who's struggling with faith, especially someone who has experienced loss or tragedy and is using that pain as a reason to reject God. Your sharing might be the tool God uses to begin their conversion, just as Carlo's prophecy was the tool God used to begin mine. And in the comments below, I want you to share your own story of encountering something you couldn't explain naturally, or a time when someone knew something they shouldn't have been able to know. Don't hold back. Be vulnerable. Be specific. Because your testimony might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear to open their heart to God's reality. Remember the words that Carlo spoke to me that day in the computer lab, 8 years before I became a priest. God's plans are higher than our plans, and death isn't the end, but a transition to eternal life. He was right. And he and Matteo are proving it every day by the fruit their deaths continue to bear in my life, and in the lives of everyone who hears their story. May Blessed Carlo Acutis pray for you. May his intercession bring you closer to Jesus. And may you have the courage to say yes to whatever God is calling you to, no matter how impossible it seems from your current perspective.